Breaking news in Matthews County, where a couple has been found brutally murdered in their New Point home. The bodies of 51 and 49-year-old Adam and Melissa Moore were discovered by first responders after they had been violently murdered from multiple stab wounds. Police say the victim's 24-year-old son, who is currently at large, is a person of interest in the case after investigators found his initials, JTM, written in blood on the wall of their home.
And I just went crazy. I know I killed him. I felt a release.
A double homicide investigation in Matthews County. Police charged this man, Jonathan Moore. They say he stabbed his own parents to death, Adam and Melissa Moore. Deputies found their bodies at their home on White Point Lane on Monday. Police say they found Jonathan Moore in Lynchburg yesterday, though, after driving off in his father's truck and arrested him.
I am from Matthews County, from the Sheriff's Office. I work investigation.
I would like to speak to a lawyer.
Okay. All right. Do you plan to hire one, or would you want one court appointed, or what would your plan be?
I would like to represent myself.
So right out of the gate, he's wanting a lawyer. And what does that say about him? I think it goes back to that old saying where a lawyer who represents himself has a fool for a client. And I think that gives us our first glimpse into who he thinks he is. He thinks he's much smarter than what he actually is. He thinks he's much more sophisticated than what he actually is.
And what am I being held for? What charges?
They're going to go over that with you.
Now that's very interesting to say that, because just because I say the lawyer word, I don't understand why you can't tell me.
But they are serious charges, and they are related to crimes against people.
Serious charges for crimes against people, in what nature?
And homicide.
Homicide charges.
Mm-hmm.
Really?
Yes, sir. That's way far off from the reality of the situation. Right.
Names of the homicide victims. Names of the homicide victims.
That would be Melissa and Adam Moore.
My parents. I homicided my parents. That's the charge right now? On what premise?
We can't really talk to you about that. You've ordered up.
The nature of the incident may present itself to be something that it's not. I feel that very important to say.
There is a shocking level of grandiosity, I find, in his presentation when you think about all of the data points. So his hand is lacerated and wrapped. We know that they found evidence at the scene of the murders with his initials in blood written on the wall. He's being investigated for this, but yet has no emotional response to the fact that he's been told his parents have been murdered. And he just sits there really calmly, I think, trying to fish for a little information to find out what they know, but also perhaps a little uncertain of where he wants to go with this.
Where will I be held? What situation is that going to be?
He'll tell you that. He'll go over that with you.
All right, good luck to you. Just sit tight until you guys take care of you. All right. Excuse me. Hey, buddy.
But he gets really antsy, a little uncomfortable, because he wants to share his story. He wants to control the narrative here. He cannot sit still and let so much time go by because it's just very boring for him. And, typical of psychopaths is they do need some sort of arousal. They have a propensity towards getting the attention, because if they don't, then there's nothing to them and they're gonna, just be bored and fall apart. So he wants to engage them.
We came all the way here from Matthews for homicide. I'm just gonna cut the right now and be completely real with you. Okay? Give me 1 minute.
Hey, what's that?
I felt the need to get more information from you before you leave tonight and before I go on to wherever the next step is here. Like, what am I going up against? So that's double homicide?
Yes.
And what's the penalty for that, Virginia?
There's a lot of factors that come into play, so I couldn't even really begin to tell you.
The class
2.
He's really trying to get as much information as he can from detectives so he can plan out the rest of what he's going to tell them. And also that is because he wants to see what he can get down the road in terms of sentencing, in terms of the punishment.
So only you know this in your mind, what happened. So how you choose to handle whatever it is that happened is going to determine what that outcome is going to be for you.
Sorry, by God, I do not want to delay. Blood is on my hands. I cut my own hands. I killed my parents.
Are you just saying,
I killed her.
figuratively, blood is on your hands, or are you saying you have blood on your hands
I'm
right
saying
now?
I went into the house and I knocked on their door in a fit of rage that was built up from years of many, many traumas that were never resolved, and they let me in, and I just went crazy. It was a blackout kind of thing, where I remember, I know I killed him. I felt a release. I felt there was blood everywhere, all over me.
When it comes to his description of the release and the blackout, he can kind of control this narrative that he wants them to believe that he's not a bad person, that there was some kind of unresolved trauma. If he had a release, it was because he was aware of what he was doing. He enjoyed what he was doing. Was he blacked out? I mean, he was blacked out from his sense of normalcy and decency, but he wasn't blacked out in what we think of as being blacked out.
There's a weird dynamic there. And growing up being a kid, you're a kid, so I've respected them. That's how they raised me.
I'm sure.
And it just became too much because it became obsessive control. And it became where I just wanted to be a little bit more free to myself and do things on my own. And that trying to find that balance, it was unachievable. And I just reached a peak on the 6th, the night of June 6th, probably around 10 p.m. Went into the house. I was heavily intoxicated on alcohol and not in a clear frame of mind, and heavy in rage, and grabbed some knives out of the block, threw them on my pants, knocked on the door, and just closed basically. Just went crazy.
More Moore describes his parents as overbearing or controlling, and that's very damaging to a psychopath. It's undercutting their emotions, their control. He doesn't want them around because they really chipped at his ego by telling him what to do, when to do it.
And I don't like thinking that now that I've done this, that my life is going to be just completely forever. That is, for me, that's the biggest reason why I just want to be really clear and honest right now. Will I be at least in a position where I won't be in danger? Because right now I can't defend myself with my hand being injured. I'm definitely going to need a reset. I got decent size, but I know there's people bigger than me, so I'm not ready for that. I don't know what, if anything, could be arranged for trying to reach something easier for me to be introduced into that zone. I guess I will just get thrown into the fire initially. I'm mixed up.
Moore is approaching this like a quid pro quo. Like, you know, I gave you something. I gave you a confession. Now you give me something. And now he just wants to move on to the next transaction and to basically get his own instrumental needs met. So that in and of itself, by the way, is callous. There's clearly no remorse for killing his parents. And he doesn't really want to tell the truth. He's basically just saying, yeah, I just told the truth because I want a better outcome for my case. And then he takes it a step further and unbelievably is now asking for concessions.
Is this already in the public news? Like, is this...
Now, the press, I'm sure you know, is going to have the right to dig.
You said I'll be looked at differently for being honest.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm a pretty damn big stand right now on Matthews, which is a pretty good place to live.
Anything else that you need from me before I make that long trip back? What?
The cat's alive. Are the cats alive? What is the situation with it? Where are they going?
Don't worry about that. Like I said, we're taking care of things. I just don't know what the permanent situation will be, but we're working on that.
He seems far more concerned about the cats than he does his remaining family and friends in the community. And that's the thing with psychopathy, is that we now think of psychopathy on a continuum. And we know that there are people, for example, who harm animals. On another side of that aspect of psychopathy, there are people who actually form bonds with animals. And one theory is that they form bonds with pets or animals because animals can't reject them.
Do you have an idea? Are you near a computer?
No. Why?
Well, I just wanted you to look up maybe previous cases and recent cases in Virginia that were first-degree murder ×2. I'm going to try and talk to my attorney about getting that reduced, though, because I did not premeditate or plan to kill my parents. It all happened very fast, so I don't think that's really fair to get charged with that. I think it should be reduced.
You're not particularly in a position to talk about fair, you know.
And that's unfair to say. I mean, you can't just take the rights away from me because I committed a crime. That would be something that we do to terrorists or in Iran or Afghanistan. Well, I just don't want you to think of me so bad.
That he doesn't want her to see him in a bad way. And that mimics or mirrors what he was trying to do with detectives. He's controlling how others are seeing him. Again, if he's looked at this as this murderous person, this horrible person, that's gonna hurt his ego. He doesn't want to be seen that way. It's very pejorative to psychopaths. He wants to be seen as the victim here.
Why wouldn't you be
At
able to
least
get the stuff from the house, Nana?
we don't have any right to get it because it's not ours to get. That's very complicated.
I mean, cash in my wallet.
Because you can't have that. Well, I don't. Because you're accused of a crime, and so you can't have. It's like if you go into jail, they take all your personal belongings, like your wallet and all that kind of stuff. And I don't, sweetheart.
I think extra.
He has a huge sense of entitlement. He believes that he should be getting all of the stuff that he wants when he wants it. He wasn't able to get it from the detectives. He expects to get it from his grandmother. And never does he ever think about how is she feeling given everything that's going on. The psychopath often is so detached from another person's emotional state. It's called alexithymia, when you can't interpret your emotions and you can't interpret the emotions of other people.
That was a terrible crime, and you know there's a huge price to pay for it, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, I think about, in the case of what would the victims want, and the victims wouldn't want anything near as what's going on or what has already happened.
Oh,
as punishment.
The victims would want their life, darling.
Well, they probably are having better in heaven. Almost every time someone dies, it's not by their own choice. And almost every time someone dies, it's not by their own choice. It seems like in my case, it's been extra in multiple different ways so far.
How so?
I explained what happened. My dad literally told me I was killing him last week. For the last month, they've been talking about their life insurance policies. They wouldn't talk to me. They've been going crazy. They wouldn't let me leave. I tried to leave and live on my own. They would not let me do it. They literally physically blocked me in.
Well, you weren't supposed to kill them, darling. I'm sorry, I love you, but there's nothing right about that.
So I think at this point, Moore is trying to spell out his motive here. He mentions that his parents have been talking about a life insurance policy. And we know from records from before that he was talking to a friend while intoxicated about, killing his parents for money. It does fit his narrative to kill his parents for the money. He still wants what they have, which is money. Not emotion, not love, but money. And so how does he get what he wants without having them in the picture? He kills them.
How many wrongs make a right? There's no equation for anything that happened. But I feel like there's still no justification for some of the things that happened to me already. And there's no justification for withholding my wallet and my money from me so that I can add to my commissary while I'm here.
Yeah, well, whether you think it's justifiable or not, apparently the law does.
The law is moldable, like Play-Doh. I mean, be realistic. If I had a good attorney, I probably wouldn't be here right now.
I'm sorry, honey. I don't. We're all suffering. What you did and didn't.
Really, no. No, not everyone is suffering. No, that's not true. No.
I'm suffering, and your granddad is suffering, and your aunts and uncles are suffering. We're all suffering. We're hurting. Our hearts are broken.
Mark County 911, tell me exactly what happened. So my sister, she's on her little something weird. I haven't seen her with her husband in 2 days, and I go into their room and I find his body just wrapped up in blankets. And she's not here right now. I don't know where the she is. There's blood all over him. There's bruises all over his back. It's dry. He's face down in a blanket. He is dead for sure.
This nationwide manhunt continues for the person who detectives say is responsible for murdering her husband. This is 28-year-old Stormy Delahanty. She left her apartment in a white 2010 Mazda 6 with a Kentucky license plate. She was last seen in Utah yesterday.
This isn't the first time they've had an altercation. Like, one time she was very drunk and she almost killed him. Like, she started choking him out.
So your sister, like, she would beat Roman's ass. She could beat Roman's ass.
Roman doesn't believe in hitting women, and so he would just take it. I don't know if Roman was texting other girls or something, but he would, like, leave the house at night sometimes, and he'd always say it was drinking, like drinking with friends, but she never believed that. Like,
did that anger her?
Him leaving, yes, that very much upset her.
According to criminal records, Stormy Delahanty has a long criminal history where she is very versatile in her offenses, everything from DUI, fleeing a crime scene, harassment of a police officer. These are all things that speak to somebody that just acts out however she wants, doesn't care about social norms, and even will act out violently, showing that she has very poor behavioral controls.
Do you think that Stormy would be capable of having some type of domestic assault while intoxicated? Let's just hypothetically say accidentally or purposely killed Roman.
Yes.
Where's the name Stormy?
I have all kinds of fun stories for So, I was born in 92, right after Desert Storm.
Oh, yeah.
So, they named me Stormy. I didn't think about changing it, dude. I love it free. But what I named myself then.
Stormy, you are like so smart and what you've been through, you know what I mean? You're an interesting person.
Yeah.
You're smart. Well, what's your degree in?
Psychology. And
Really?
Sociology. I'm smart in some things. You can't give me credit for all of it. So I thought that would be a pretty cool thing because you study like people's minds and, you know, and then you study like how people work together in society. And like I could like feel normal-ish, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
She definitely comes across as very nonchalant and casual, not on guard at all. One interpretation of that is that she has that trait of, you know, low emotionality that psychopaths have. She has no personal knowledge of how people's minds work or how you're supposed to function in society, because that's the reason that she chose to study these things. And it was the thing that enabled her to feel normal-ish, which is quite a good description of the fact that psychopaths don't have that direct experience of certain normal human emotions, and they have to study them.
I should probably like talk to the attorney and then contact you guys.
That's Stormy,
right?
That's your decision.
Right.
Okay.
Or I could just talk to you guys.
You
told us out there that you wanted an attorney.
Well, I know I can stop talking, but I'm saying, like, I don't, like, want to start talking and then, like, get flustered and then, you know what I mean? Like, dig myself into some hole and then, like, I go talk to the attorney and then the attorney be like, why'd you do this? For me, I think I would prefer to speak to the attorney.
She's now changed her tactic. She's playing a little bit of cat and mouse with them, talking about how she wants to talk to them, but she also wants a lawyer. This is a woman who is far more seasoned in how the legal system works, and she's consciously sticking a finger in the pot and saying, I want to help you, I want to talk to you, but I want an attorney. And she's teasing the cops.
Stormy, I know you're stressed out.
I drank, like, so much so quickly that, like, I don't remember a lot. I don't know what happened or something. I remember he threw me off the bed onto the floor and, like, had my breath back. The next thing I remember is just him on the ground in a puddle of blood.
Where at?
By the front door. It was like, it wasn't me. You know what I mean? Like, I wasn't consciously in control. I don't know how to describe it, honestly. Like, it was like
you were so
someone else
intoxicated.
was, like, controlling. It was like being, like, a marionette. You know what I mean? I remember going and getting a towel. And it was, like, wiping. I guess I kept complaining. I don't understand how it got to that. Like, what, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like I'm a violent person. I could tell, like, he was dead, you know what I mean? And it was like when I was cleaning that up, it was like I was on, like an autopilot. From there, I remember pulling him down to the bedroom.
Delahunty doesn't really discuss her memory in a way that's plausible. She's making it sound like there's this massive gap of time, what we might refer to as an en bloc blackout. And while her pattern of alcohol use is not inconsistent with a pattern of blackouts, the fact that she keeps changing what she remembers is not how alcohol-induced blackouts work. And Delahunty, again, her narcissism and her own arrogance that she thinks she's just gonna lie her way through these interviews, it starts to come unraveled.
So at what point in time during the day did you actually finally come out?
I didn't. The whole next day, I didn't. I stayed in my room. The entire day.
You did, because there was, you made some purchases on the 5th. Were you still intoxicated?
I don't remember coming out at all. I thought I stayed in my room that whole day because I kept drinking.
I think what Stormy is doing is trying to put her first attempt at a story together, see what detectives come back at her with. If they don't confront her with anything, then she knows, oh, my story stood. If they confront her with something, she has the ultimate confidence in herself that she can keep evolving the story, come up with a new lie, and a new lie after that. Psychopaths will pathologically lie for their own benefit. They're very effective liars because they don't feel guilty.
Not the 6th, it was the 5th. Remember where you went?
Well, yeah, I remember going several places, but I didn't think it like 2 days. Because I remember like waking up and it's like I couldn't stay awake, you know what I mean? And then I fell back to sleep. And I think they did that like a lot. Like I'd wake up for a second and then I just fall right back to sleep. And then I thought it was the next day that I was out.
No, it was the following day. It was the show.
I remember going to the store and buying stuff.
Yeah. So do you remember where you went? When you went shopping?
Yeah. I went to the hardware store.
Do you remember everything that you bought?
A bunch of cleaning supplies. Some shear cutters and a saw. First I was thinking like, you know, maybe try to hide it.
Talking about hiding him.
Right. Or something, you know what I mean? Like hide him. Like I don't know what. I mean, obviously I wasn't going to be able to do anything. That's why I left, you know what I mean?
For most of us, we couldn't even fathom harming a human being, much less dismembering them after the fact. It's too horrific and graphic to consider. So for Stormy Delahunty, whether or not she completed the task is almost irrelevant. The fact is she considered doing it, she was open to the idea of doing it, and she actually took functional steps to go purchase equipment to dismember her husband's body. And what this really shows is a level of callousness, a lack of connection to a human being, and a lack of empathy and remorse for her actions. This is somebody who was 100% in self-preservation mode. And when you see that lack of regard for human beings and that level of callousness, not only is it a marker of psychopathic behavior, but it speaks to the fact that she was really only focused on herself in that moment.
Like I said, like, I know he's dead, it just still doesn't seem like, or feel like, you know what I mean? Like, it feels like one big nightmare. It feels you know what I mean? Like,
You remember?
Yeah. We were like each other's like best friends for like, you know what I mean?
Were you ever fearful that Roman was going to leave you at any time?
No,
that's good.
So.
There was a very palpable pause in her answer when the detective asks her, did you ever think that he might leave you? My take on her description of their relationship is that it's rehearsed. You know, it's what a psychopath learns to say. From the brother's description, it was hardly that of two best friends. So it's not likely that that's a genuine sentiment. If she wants to be a sympathetic character, she's got to behave a certain way and say certain things. And that's what drives her choices, not because she's genuinely feeling these things.
At any point in time, like when you were cleaning up and that stuff, when did you realize those knives were relevant to what happened? Do you recall that?
Not really. I think they were sitting on, like, beside him.
Racking my brains, just trying to see if there's anything else. I mean, but you don't recall any of the actions that led up to him being stabbed, right?
Correct. All black.
And that was just the easiest.
Auto-pilot, like, you know what I mean? It's like I wasn't in control.
Sure.
You know? I guess it has to be the amount of liquor I can drink, because honestly, no.
The 28-year-old Delahunty was extremely talkative on the stand. She admitted the two drank together excessively, and on July 4th of last year, things turned volatile when she asked to see his phone.
So I'm trying to fumble through his phone, and in the meantime, while I'm like flipping through the music selection, I hit that button twice and it brings up all the open apps on his phone. And so, being the nosy wife, I start flashing through those, and I click on his text messages. And within one of his text messages, I see a picture of a girl. She's in a towel, and her hair is in a towel. And so I recall asking him, like, who is this girl? And he just looked at me like I was silly. He was trying to deny that this picture was there. I'm questioning him about this photo, and that's when he like lunges and throws me off my bed, and he's pinning me down, and he's screaming at me, "Is this what you want? Is this what you want? Is this?" And I'm kind of confused. Is what I want? He throws, like, throws me, and I end up hitting my head on this amp, and then next thing I know, I'm cleaning up blood. I don't know what happened. I do recall getting up, standing up, but that's it.
She's come up with a news story that she thinks now will be more believable, particularly for a jury. She's now playing a new role, which is, I'm just like the rest of you. I'm like every other wife who hasn't gone through their husband's phone and accidentally hit the button, but I saw something that probably none of you guys did, which is this other woman, and this is...
The water was too calm for what it was hiding. Sydney Harbor at dawn in the winter of 1999, lying flat and metallic. Ferries cutting silent lines through the mist while joggers traced the shoreline, unaware that something had already gone terribly wrong, that a story was beginning its long, unfinished echo, a cold case before anyone knew to call it that, a disappearance that would harden into legend, fracture a family, and leave a city staring at the same stretch of water for decades, asking the same question and never hearing an answer. It starts with a phone that never rings back, with a woman named Claire Bennett, who is supposed to be home by Sunday night, who left her Balmain terrace after an argument no one would later agree on, who walked out with her handbag, her coat, and the kind of finality that only seems obvious in hindsight, and by Monday morning, when she still hadn't called her sister, the absence felt heavier than it should have. A missing person report filed almost casually, as if the city itself believed she'd return once the mood passed, once the air cleared, once the harbor exhaled whatever secret it was holding. Claire was 32, a marketing consultant, sharp, composed, known for routines and reliability, not the type to vanish into thin air, not the type to abandon her car parked near Circular Quay, keys still inside, not the type to miss work without warning, and as police walked the promenade retracing her last confirmed steps, they found nothing dramatic, no blood, no struggle. Just the slow realization that something ordinary had snapped and left behind a void that refused to explain itself. The community watched as flyers went up, faces memorized by strangers, her smile reproduced in black and white on lampposts and shop windows, and the harbor became a suspect by proximity alone, searched by divers who descended into the murk where visibility collapsed into darkness within meters, where decades of debris layered the seabed like forgotten evidence, but the water yielded no body, no clothing, no final proof, only silence that fed speculation and sharpened fear. Within days, the headlines hardened: mysterious disappearance near Sydney Harbor, young woman missing, no leads, and then the phrase that changes everything slipped into print: cold case, whispered first by reporters, then by detectives who felt the temperature drop as time passed without traction, without witnesses coming forward, without CCTV delivering the miracle frame that would freeze the truth into focus. And as the investigation slowed, attention narrowed inward, toward the people who knew Claire best. Her family closed ranks and fractured at the same time, a father rigid with certainty that she'd been taken, a sister sleepless and spiraling through guilt, and a husband, Mark Bennett, whose calm unnerved the tabloids, whose statements were technically flawless, emotionally sparse, a man who said all the right things and somehow nothing at all, and when police asked about the argument the night she vanished, The answers shifted just enough to draw a red circle around the marriage. Neighbors recalled raised voices, a slammed door, the thin walls of Balmat terraces carrying more than they should, and friends spoke of tension, of finances, of infidelity rumors that had never been confirmed, and the investigation leaned in, searching for cracks, searching for motive, for a confession disguised as fatigue or grief. But Mark Bennett gave them nothing solid, no alibi that collapsed, no evidence that stuck, just a presence that lingered uncomfortably at the center of the storm. As weeks turned into months, the city moved on in the way cities always do, but the case didn't dissolve. It calcified, became one of those stories people bring up in taxis, on late-night radio, in online forums that would later explode with amateur theories, each one more certain than the last, each one built on fragments and suspicion, and the harbor, ever present, became a symbol, a mirror reflecting back whatever fear the viewer brought with them. Then came the first strange lead, a call to Crime Stoppers from a voice that refused to identify itself, claiming Claire had been seen boarding a private vessel late that night, that she wasn't alone, that the argument hadn't ended at the front door, and police followed the thread only to watch it dissolve under scrutiny, logs incomplete, memories unreliable, the ocean too vast and too willing to erase its own tracks, leaving investigators with nothing but the sense they were circling something just out of reach. The years pressed on, the file thickened, the urgency thinned, and yet the case refused to die, resurfacing whenever another body was pulled from the water, whenever another woman went missing near the coast, whenever a reporter needed a reminder that some questions never age out of relevance, and inside the Bennett family the absence metastasized, dinners missing a chair, holidays punctured by what wasn't said, suspicions settling into the spaces where trust used to live. By the time the case was officially labeled inactive, by the time the words "no further investigative avenues" were quietly attached, Sydney had absorbed the story into its collective memory, a cautionary tale wrapped in mist and unresolved grief, a cold case closed on paper but still breathing in the dark corners of conversation, still waiting for the one detail, the one betrayal, the one truth that would finally force the harbor to give back what it took, and somewhere beneath the calm surface of that winter water, the beginning of the answer remained suspended, unseen, refusing to stay buried. By the second year, the case had developed a rhythm of disappointment, every new tip arriving with a pulse of hope and leaving behind a longer shadow when it collapsed, detectives rotating in and out, each convinced they would be the one to see what the others had missed, each eventually standing in the same rooms, staring at the same photographs, listening to the same interviews played back until the voices lost warmth and became artifacts. And through it all the harbor remained unchanged. Blue on postcards, black in memory, a backdrop that refused to testify. Police rebuilt Claire Bennett's final day minute by minute, receipts time-stamped, phone pings mapped across the city, like a constellation that ended abruptly near the water, her last call placed at 8:47 p.m., short, clipped, to her husband, content unknown, tone debated endlessly, some hearing anger, others fear, and after that, nothing. A digital flatline that investigators circled as if proximity alone could coax it back to life. They questioned ferry operators, bar staff, street musicians, anyone who might remember a woman alone on the promenade that night, and memories surfaced warped by time and attention, a blonde woman crying near the rail, a couple arguing under a street lamp, a figure standing too still, but each description contradicted the last, a collage of half-seen moments that never aligned into a face police could name, a narrative they could anchor. The focus inevitably returned to Mark Bennett, the husband who remained present but distant, who attended press conferences with measured expressions, who appealed for information without urgency, and whose financial records, once subpoenaed, revealed pressure points, a business struggling, debts stacking quietly, a life that looked stable from the outside but hummed with strain beneath the surface, and while none of it proved violence, it sharpened suspicion into something the media could sharpen further. Tabloids fed the fire, headlines splashing words like betrayal, secret life, marriage in crisis, and neighbors began to reframe memories, casual moments reinterpreted as warning signs, the human tendency to retrofit meaning onto the past, turning rumor into something that felt like evidence. And Mark, once a sympathetic figure, found himself isolated, watched, judged in grocery store aisles and on quiet streets where whispers followed him like a second shadow. Detectives pressed harder, re-interviewed him late into the night, probed inconsistencies that might have been nothing more than stress fractures and grief, and still he held answer steady, lawyer present, no confession slipping through, no sudden rage, just the infuriating persistence of a man who knew his rights and exercised them, leaving investigators to wonder if composure was a mask or simply the shape of his mourning. Then, 3 years after Claire vanished, the harbor gave up something, not her, but a handbag snagged in debris during routine dredging, waterlogged, unrecognizable at first, until a serial number on a damaged phone inside traced back to Claire's account, the discovery sending shockwaves through the city, cameras returning to the shoreline, experts arguing over currents, over whether the bag had been there all along or placed later. A staged artifact meant to provoke, mislead, or taunt. Forensic analysis yielded little. Salt water had erased fingerprints, DNA degraded beyond use, but the timing reignited everything, reopened wounds that had barely scarred, and within days, police announced renewed interest in the case, a review of suspects, a re-examination of family dynamics, and once again Mark Bennett's name rose to the surface, heavier now, burdened by the implication that the harbor itself had pointed back toward him. Friends of Claire spoke more freely, emboldened by time, recounting conversations about fear, about feeling watched, about a marriage that had begun to feel like a negotiation rather than a partnership, while others defended Mark fiercely, insisting on his gentleness, his devotion, the danger of turning absence into accusation, and the community split along invisible lines, belief hardening into camps that argued not just about guilt, but about what kind of story this disappearance was allowed to become. Police quietly explored another angle, one less public, tracing links to organized crime rumored to use the harbor's private docks, examining whether Claire's work had brought her into contact with someone dangerous, someone who saw her as leverage or liability. But those trails led into closed circles and sealed lips. A reminder that Sydney's beauty coexisted with a subterranean economy that thrived on silence and distance. As the investigation widened, it also thinned, resources diverted, priorities shifting, and the cold case designation crept back in, this time heavier, more final, and when a coroner eventually ruled Claire presumed dead, without cause or manner determined, the word closure was used carefully, like a fragile object that might shatter if handled too directly, a bureaucratic necessity that satisfied no one who had loved her. Years later, when new detectives reviewed the file, they noted something overlooked, a small transaction, a boat rental paid in cash under a false name the night Claire disappeared, a detail buried beneath louder theories, and while it was never proven to be connected, it lingered, a reminder that truth often hides not in dramatic revelations but in the margins, waiting for someone patient enough to read everything twice. The city learned to live with the uncertainty, but it never forgot, and every time fog rolled in across the harbor, every time water slapped against stone with that hollow, echoing sound, the story resurfaced unfinished, unresolved, a cold case that refused to stay closed, its unanswered questions drifting just beneath the surface, close enough to sense, too deep to reach, still shaping lives long after the headlines had moved on. Time did what it always does to a case like this. It sanded down the sharpest edges while deepening the grooves underneath, and by the late 2000s the Sydney Harbor disappearance had become institutional memory inside the police force, a thick binder pulled from shelves for training, for cold case reviews, for moments when someone wanted to remind a roomful of rookies that not every story ends with handcuffs and a press conference. Some simply end with a question mark that never fades. A new detective, Lisa Hargreaves, was assigned during one of those periodic reviews, younger than the file, unburdened by the assumptions that had calcified around it, and she approached the case not as a tragedy, but as a pattern, spreading documents across a conference table, timelines bleeding into each other, noticing how often attention had surged and receded, how momentum had been driven less by evidence than by emotion, by what the city needed to believe at different moments. She started with the harbor again, not as a single location but as a system, mapping currents, private docks, marinas, access points invisible to tourists, places where a boat could slip in and out without paperwork, without witnesses who would later remember, and she noted how little of this geography had been seriously examined in 1999, when technology lagged and assumptions did the heavy lifting. Hargreaves reopened interviews that had gone cold, tracking down names that had become footnotes, ferry workers now retired, bartenders who had moved suburbs, a security guard who had worked the night shift near Circular Quay, and once mentioned seeing a woman arguing with a man near a private mooring, a statement dismissed at the time because it didn't fit the prevailing narrative. Because the man didn't resemble the husband everyone was watching. Memory, she knew, was unreliable, but patterns weren't, and she listened for consistency rather than detail, for the emotional weight certain moments still carried years later, and what emerged wasn't a clear suspect, but a sense of movement. Claire not wandering aimlessly but being guided, persuaded, possibly coerced, away from public spaces and toward the water's edge where the city thinned out and the rules softened. The file on Mark Bennett was reopened with equal parts caution and fatigue, financial stress revisited, phone records reanalyzed with newer software, subtle gaps highlighted where calls should have been but weren't, and while nothing directly implicated him, the absence of chaos around his timeline remained unsettling, a man whose night stayed too orderly for the disappearance it framed, a detail that nagged without crossing the line into proof. Then there was the family, still fractured, still careful with each other. Claire's sister agreeing to speak again after years of refusal, her voice steadier now, grief processed into something quieter but no less heavy, and she mentioned a detail that hadn't made it into early statements, a name Claire had dropped once, casually, someone she'd met through work who owned a boat, who liked to talk about the harbor at night, about how different the city felt after dark, a comment that had seemed harmless then, forgettable until time rearranged its importance. That name led nowhere directly, a common surname, multiple matches, a dead end that frustrated Hargreaves but didn't stop her, because cold cases rarely broke open through doors. They seeped, leaked, reassembled themselves from overlooked fragments, and she turned instead to bank records again, tracing cash withdrawals made by Claire in the weeks before she vanished, amounts too small to alarm, too consistent to ignore, suggesting planning or pressure, a quiet preparation for something unspoken. The media caught wind of the renewed interest and circled back like a familiar predator, recycling old footage, reusing the same harbor shots, and once again Mark Bennett's face filled screens, older now, lines carved by years of scrutiny, and he responded with the same restraint, granting a single interview in which he insisted nothing had changed, that reopening wounds didn't heal them, his words calm but edged with resentment. A man exhausted by suspicion, yet never fully escaping it. As public interest spiked and faded again, Hargreaves followed a thinner thread, the anonymous Crime Stoppers call from years earlier, re-listening to the recording, isolating background noise, a faint hum that audio specialists now suggested could be a marina generator, a detail impossible to confirm but impossible to unhear once identified, and it reframed that call not as a hoax, but as a voice calling from proximity, someone close enough to the harbor that night to absorb its sounds into their memory. The theory that emerged was incomplete, fragile, but compelling. Claire meeting someone she trusted or feared enough to follow, stepping onto a private vessel under the illusion of conversation or closure, the argument continuing not on the street but on water, where no one could hear, and whatever happened next leaving no witnesses willing or able to speak, the harbor swallowing evidence with practiced efficiency. Still, theory without proof is just another story, and as months passed without a breakthrough, pressure mounted to close the review, to relabel the case unsolved once more, and Hargreaves felt the familiar pull of institutional fatigue, the sense that the truth might be knowable but unreachable, locked behind a single missing fact that no amount of diligence could manufacture. When the review ended, quietly, without announcement, the file returned to the shelf heavier than before, annotated, refined, but no closer to resolution, and Sydney exhaled again, the brief return of uncertainty receding back into the background noise of the city. Yet for those who had touched the case, for those who still lived with its absence, the disappearance remained active in a deeper sense, a presence that shifted but never left. At night, when the harbor lights stretched across the water in trembling lines, the story resurfaced not as a headline but as a feeling, a reminder that some betrayals don't announce themselves, they unfold slowly, invisibly, until years later all that's left is a question drifting between past and present, unresolved, persistent, and waiting. The case slipped back into dormancy, but it didn't sleep. It lingered in the margins of other investigations, surfacing whenever a name overlapped, a boat changed hands, a financial record twitched in a way that felt familiar, and in the early 2010s that twitch came from a place no one had been watching anymore, a probate court file tied to a distant relative of Mark Bennett, a man who owned a small but well-equipped motor cruiser moored in a private marina west of the city, a vessel sold quietly 2 weeks after Claire vanished. The sale itself wasn't illegal, it wasn't even unusual, but the timing felt wrong, the kind of wrong that doesn't scream but hums, and when detectives pulled the marina logs they found gaps, maintenance entries missing, a night in June 1999 where the security camera feed glitched for 43 minutes, explained away at the time as a power fluctuation, forgotten until someone finally had a reason to remember it. The owner, long since deceased, left behind a trail of half-truths, a history of helping family without paperwork, cash loans, favors that never showed up on balance sheets, and when investigators spoke to former marina staff, one name surfaced again and again, Mark Bennett, not as an owner, not as a regular, but as someone who knew the docks, who'd been seen there before, who looked comfortable among ropes and cleats and fuel hoses, a detail that contradicted his carefully maintained image of a man uninterested in boats, indifferent to the water that defined his city. Nothing about it crossed the threshold into an arrest, but the shape of the story began to change. Not a stranger's crime, not a random act swallowed by the harbor, but something closer, quieter, bound up in family loyalty and silence, the kind of betrayal that doesn't explode but implodes, collapsing inward until there's no obvious crime scene left to examine. Claire's sister felt it first, the shift in tone when police asked new questions, the way they stopped asking what Claire might have done and started asking who might have helped, who might have looked the other way, and she revisited her own memories with a cruelty she'd avoided for years, recalling how Mark had once joked about the harbor being cleaner than people think, how he'd insisted on handling certain finances himself, how small dismissals accumulated into a pattern that only made sense after everything else fell apart. The media didn't have access to these nuances, but they sensed movement, publishing speculative pieces about family secrets and hidden vessels, and the city reacted with a familiar mixture of outrage and fatigue, some demanding answers at last, others accusing police of witch hunts, and Mark Bennett retreated further, declining interviews, communicating only through lawyers. His public silence now interpreted not as dignity, but as strategy. Investigators attempted one more reconstruction, this time not of Claire's final walk, but of the harbor itself on that night, tidal charts overlaid with weather reports, wind direction mapped against likely routes a small cruiser could take without attracting attention, and the result was unsettling. A narrow window of time where a boat leaving the marina could have reached open water, returned, and been secured again before most of the city realized the night had deepened. They tested the theory against what little physical evidence existed, the recovered handbag, the phone inside, and experts concluded that the bag's condition was consistent not with long-term submersion but with intermittent exposure, as if it had been stored, then discarded later, a conclusion impossible to prove definitively but corrosive to the idea that Claire had simply fallen or jumped into the water on her own. One retired officer, brought back in as a consultant, said what others wouldn't, that if the harbor had been used, it had been used by someone who understood it, who knew where cameras didn't reach and paperwork thinned, and that kind of knowledge was rarely accidental, rarely learned overnight, and rarely shared with outsiders. The pressure built quietly, not enough for charges, but enough to fracture what remained of the Bennett family, private arguments spilling into legal correspondence, inheritance disputes reopening old wounds, and in those documents, investigators found references to cash transfers made in the months after Claire's disappearance, explained as support, framed as generosity, but timed too precisely to ignore. Money moving where explanations lagged behind. Still, no one talked, not fully, not enough, and the case stalled again, its center of gravity hovering over the same names without ever landing, a frustration that gnawed at those still assigned to it, because the picture now felt almost complete, missing only the one element no cold case can survive without, a witness willing to break the pact of silence. Years passed, and Sydney changed, new buildings rising along the harbor, old marinas redeveloped, the physical landscape erasing the very spaces the theory depended on, and with each demolition another potential answer vanished, replaced by glass and steel and the insistence that the city was moving forward whether its past liked it or not. For those who remembered Claire Bennett, the disappearance hardened into something personal, a lesson about proximity and trust, about how danger doesn't always come from the dark edges of a city, but from the familiar hands that guide you there, and at night, when the water lay smooth and unbroken, the thought lingered that the harbor hadn't taken her, it had merely been used, a silent accomplice in a story that still refused to end. The silence finally cracked from the inside, not with a confession but with a death, the kind that reorders old loyalties and loosens tongues that have been clenched for years, when Mark Bennett's uncle-in-law, a man peripheral enough to avoid headlines yet close enough to matter, died in a coastal nursing facility after a brief illness, and among the personal effects turned over to family was a battered notebook no one could quite place, pages swollen with age, ink faded, entries written like reminders to himself rather than records meant to survive. The notebook changed hands quietly, passed from a niece to a cousin to a solicitor, until someone noticed dates that aligned too neatly with the summer of 1999, references to fuel, to tides, to a favor repaid, language vague enough to be dismissed and precise enough to chill, and when detectives finally obtained it through a reluctant disclosure, they treated it like an artifact pulled from the seabed, fragile, incomplete, but undeniably part of the wreck. There was no name written in full, no explicit admission, just initials and shorthand, but the pattern matched the marina logs, the missing night, the boat that changed ownership, and for the first time in years the case felt less like a theory and more like a mechanism, a set of actions that could be traced even if intent remained buried, and investigators leaned in, aware that momentum, once lost, rarely returned. They re-interviewed the uncle's former business partner, a man who had avoided attention by staying just outside the family circle, and under pressure he admitted to rumors, to late-night calls, to a request for temporary use of the boat that had struck him as odd even then, a request he hadn't questioned because questioning family was something their generation simply didn't do, silence being the preferred currency of loyalty. The partner's account was careful, rehearsed by time, but it placed Mark Bennett near the marina again, not directly, not conclusively, but enough to redraw the perimeter of suspicion, and when detectives confronted Mark with the notebook, with the converging timelines, his composure wavered for the first time in decades, not collapsing, but thinning. Irritation bleeding through the practiced calm as he accused police of chasing ghosts and harassing a grieving family. What followed was not an arrest but a standoff, subpoenas issued, assets examined, phone records from long-dead devices reconstructed where possible, and the legal dance began, slow and punishing, every step contested, every inference challenged, because cold cases don't explode, they grind, they test patience and budgets and the willingness of institutions to keep pressing when certainty remains just out of reach. The media sensed blood in the water again, reviving the phrase family betrayal with renewed enthusiasm, though nothing had yet been proven, and the city reacted as it always had, oscillating between outrage and doubt, between wanting closure and fearing the consequences of naming the wrong villain after so many years, a collective anxiety that hovered over the harbor like fog. Claire's sister watched all of this with a distance she'd learned to cultivate, hope tempered by experience, but when police showed her the notebook, when they explained the theory in careful, conditional language, something shifted, grief reconfiguring itself into a sharper emotion, Anger not just at what might have been done, but at the years of silence that followed, the everyday betrayals that felt almost worse than the original act. She agreed to cooperate fully, handing over old emails, bank statements, anything that might fill gaps, and in those records investigators noticed another quiet detail: a life insurance policy updated months before Claire vanished, beneficiary unchanged but coverage increased, a move that could be rationalized, explained, dismissed, yet when placed alongside everything else, it added weight to a structure already straining under implication. Still, implication is not proof, and the harbor had taught police that lesson repeatedly, that without a body, without a clear cause of death, every case rests on inference, and inference is a fragile foundation in court, especially when time has eroded memories and destroyed physical evidence. And as prosecutors reviewed the file, they hesitated, aware that a failed case would cement uncertainty rather than resolve it. Mark Bennett's lawyers moved aggressively, filing motions, threatening defamation suits, reframing the narrative as a witch hunt fueled by media pressure and the need for a villain in a story too old to satisfy modern appetites for justice. And for a moment it seemed the case might retreat again, folding back into the archive with new annotations and old questions. But cold cases have a way of exerting their own gravity, and the notebook, fragile as it was, refused to be ignored, leading investigators to one last, risky maneuver: a covert approach to a former marina night watchman now living interstate, a man who had once dismissed his own memory as unreliable but who, when shown photographs and timelines, paused longer than expected, his certainty eroding under the weight of recognition. He didn't offer a confession, didn't claim to have seen Claire, but he remembered a boat returning later than logged, remembered being told not to worry about the discrepancy, remembered the face of the man on deck looking tense, impatient, and while he couldn't swear to the date, couldn't swear to the identity, the description aligned too closely to ignore another thread tightening around the same knot. As the investigation crept forward, the city waited in a familiar, uncomfortable posture, hope coiled with skepticism, aware that even if charges were laid, even if a courtroom drama followed, the harbor might never give up its final secret, and in that uncertainty the case took on a new shape, no longer just about what happened to Claire Bennett, but about how long a family and a city could carry the weight of an unspoken truth before it finally broke the surface. The breaking point didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, through procedure, through the grinding mechanics of law that don't care about drama, when prosecutors finally agreed there was enough to move, not toward closure, but toward confrontation. A coroner's inquest announced with careful language, framed as fact-finding rather than accusation. A way to bring witnesses under oath without promising answers that might never come. The announcement rippled through Sydney like a low-frequency shock, not explosive but unsettling. Old conversations restarting mid-sentence, the harbor once again framed by camera crews who knew exactly where to stand to make calm water look ominous, and Mark Bennett, after years of deflection, was suddenly compelled to appear, to sit beneath lights and speak not in statements but in responses, where silence carried its own meaning. The inquest unfolded like a slow dissection, timelines laid bare, financial records projected onto screens, the notebook referenced obliquely, its contents summarized rather than displayed, and one by one the familiar figures took the stand: former marina staff, business partners, police officers explaining why certain paths hadn't been taken earlier. The process exposing not just potential guilt but institutional blind spots that time had mercilessly highlighted. When Mark Bennett testified, the room tightened, his voice steady at first, rehearsed over decades of anticipation, but as questions narrowed, as the scope shrank from generalities to specifics, microfractures appeared, irritation edging into defensiveness, memory suddenly uncertain where it had once been precise, and the contrast did not go unnoticed, not by the coroner, not by the journalists scribbling furiously, not by a public trained by years of true crime to read tone as evidence. He denied everything that mattered, denied ever being at the marina that night, denied asking for use of the boat, denied knowing about the cash transfers beyond what had already been explained. But denial has a shelf life, and when confronted with the watchman's testimony, tentative but sincere, with the notebook's timeline, with the life insurance adjustment. His answers slowed, not stopping but stretching, buying time that no longer existed. The coroner stopped short of naming a perpetrator, the law demanding restraint, but the findings were sharper than anyone expected, stating plainly that Claire Bennett was deceased, that the manner of death was suspicious, and that the evidence suggested involvement by someone known to her, someone with access to the harbor and assistance from at least one other individual. A conclusion that landed with the force of an accusation, even without a name attached. Outside the courtroom, the word betrayal finally felt earned, no longer a tabloid flourish, but a sober assessment of what the evidence implied, and Sydney reacted not with shock this time, but with a weary nod, as if the city had been bracing for this shape of truth all along, uncertain only of whether it would ever be spoken aloud. For Claire's sister, the findings were both vindication and loss, confirmation that her instincts hadn't been paranoia, that the years of doubt had not been imagined, but also the end of a certain kind of hope, the hope that absence might still resolve into accident, into something no one had chosen, and as she spoke briefly to reporters, her words carried no triumph, only exhaustion. A reminder that answers don't always heal the way people expect them to. Mark Bennett was not arrested that day, nor the next, nor the one after. The legal threshold still frustratingly high, the absence of a body still a wall no inference could quite climb, and yet his world shifted irreversibly, relationships severing, business ties dissolving, the unspoken verdict of public opinion proving more immediate than any court could be. He sold the Balmain Terrace, moved away from the harbor he once claimed not to care about, and for some, that retreat read like guilt, for others like survival, and the ambiguity only fueled debate, a city divided not just over what happened, but over how much certainty justice should require before it acts. The investigation remained open, officially, files still active, detectives still assigned, but everyone involved understood the reality that unless someone broke, unless a body surfaced, unless a final piece fell into place from a direction no one could predict, the case would hover in this liminal space, neither solved nor forgotten, its gravity altered but undiminished. Years later, when documentaries revisited the story, when podcasts dissected the inquest line by line, the same images returned, the calm water, the missing woman's smile, the family photographs frozen in time, and listeners were left with the same unresolved tension, the sense that the truth was close enough to outline but not close enough to touch. And at night, when ferries crossed the harbor in steady arcs of light, when the city hummed with its usual confidence, the case lingered beneath it all, a reminder that some crimes don't end with justice or absolution, they end with implication, with a collective understanding shaped by fragments and silence, and with a question that refuses to drown, no matter how calm the water appears. After the inquest, the case entered a strange afterlife, no longer dormant but not advancing, suspended in a state that felt almost intentional, as if the truth itself were pacing just out of reach, and Sydney adjusted to this new normal with practiced discomfort, learning how to live alongside a story that had teeth but no verdict, a cold case that now carried the weight of implication without the release of resolution. Police followed what little momentum remained, re-interviewing peripheral figures who had once been dismissed as background noise, relatives who had provided alibis without remembering they were doing so, friends who had loaned cars, made calls, offered favors that seemed meaningless at the time, and with each conversation the same pattern emerged, cooperation bounded by loyalty, memory softened by years of repetition. The past rehearsed until it no longer revealed its seams. Attention shifted briefly to the possibility of a second participant, the unnamed helper suggested by the coroner's findings, someone who hadn't acted out of passion but out of obligation, someone for whom silence was easier than truth, and investigators mapped the Bennett family's extended network again, marriages, business ties, shared debts, discovering how tightly interwoven their lives had been. How difficult it would have been for one person to act without another knowing. One name surfaced repeatedly, never in accusations, only in proximity. A cousin by marriage who had handled logistics for the family business, a man described as dependable, discreet, forgettable in the way that makes people useful, and when detectives questioned him, his answers were smooth, cooperative, almost eager, offering nothing that could be contradicted, nothing that lingered. And yet his phone records from 1999 contained gaps eerily similar to Mark Bennett's, absences that technology could no longer explain away. Those gaps became a quiet obsession, not proof, not even strong evidence, but a shared silence that suggested coordination, and police explored whether the two men's timelines could intersect without colliding, whether their movements that night complemented rather than conflicted, a choreography invisible to witnesses, but legible on paper if one knew where to look. The problem, as always, was time, the way it dissolves certainty, corrodes memory, and turns once solid facts into impressions, and prosecutors, reviewing the file again, weighed the risk of bringing a case built almost entirely on circumstantial alignment, aware that a failed trial would not just free a suspect but cement doubt forever, converting implication into something resembling innocence. Mark Bennett remained outwardly unchanged, older, quieter, rarely seen, but occasionally photographed in transit, his expression scrutinized as if it might finally reveal something decisive, and every image reignited argument. Online forums dissecting posture and gaze, strangers debating guilt with the confidence of jurors who would never sit in a box. The case evolving into a mirror that reflected whatever the viewer already believed. Claire Bennett's memory, meanwhile, continued to erode in public consciousness, her face aging in reverse through outdated photographs, her personality flattened into archetype, victim, wife, missing woman, and her sister fought against that reduction, giving interviews not to accuse but to remind, insisting that Claire had been vivid, complicated, stubborn, someone whose disappearance deserved more than theories, deserved truth even if justice never followed. A decade after the inquest, a new detail surfaced briefly. A contractor working on harbor redevelopment claiming to have found human remains during dredging, a rumor that spread faster than it could be verified, media vans returning like reflexes, only for the discovery to be identified as animal bone, the collective hope collapsing into embarrassment and fatigue, another false ending added to the list. The emotional toll of these moments accumulated, each near answer reopening wounds that never fully closed, and investigators, some now retired, spoke privately of the case as unfinished business, something that followed them home, into dreams, into conversations where they caught themselves lowering their voices even when no one else was listening. One former detective admitted that the most disturbing part was not the likelihood of guilt, but the plausibility of silence, the idea that a small group of people could simply agree never to speak, never to correct the record, trusting time to do what lies could not. And so far, time had rewarded that trust. As Sydney moved deeper into the 21st century, the physical evidence continued to vanish, old boats scrapped, marinas redeveloped, records digitized incompletely or lost in system upgrades, the material world quietly erasing the scaffolding of the crime, leaving only narrative and suspicion behind, and with each erasure, the odds of resolution thinned further. Yet the case refused to disappear entirely, resurfacing in classrooms, in journalism seminars, in conversations about domestic violence and hidden crime, used as an example of how proximity can mask danger, how familiarity can become camouflage, and in this way, Claire Bennett's disappearance continued to shape the city, not as a solved story, but as a warning embedded in its collective memory. The harbor, unchanged in its rhythms, carried on with ferries and fireworks and reflections of a city that preferred its surfaces smooth, but beneath that surface, the unanswered question persisted, not demanding attention, simply waiting, patient, knowing that unresolved truths don't fade, they settle, and when disturbed, they rise again, clouding the water long after everyone thought it was clear. The waiting became the story, years stacking without ceremony, the case no longer measured in days or leads but in anniversaries, in how often Claire Bennett's name resurfaced without bringing anything new with it, and then, quietly, almost apologetically, technology intruded, offering a possibility that hadn't existed when the harbor first swallowed its secret. Cold case units began revisiting evidence with tools that hadn't been available before, data recovery techniques refined, signal analysis sharpened, and among the artifacts pulled from storage was Claire's damaged phone. Long dismissed as unreadable, its memory corrupted by salt and time, but not erased entirely, and when technicians coaxed fragments from it, they didn't find messages or calls, they found location pings, incomplete but suggestive, clustering not where police had expected, but slightly west, nearer to a private marina that had already haunted the file. The discovery was not definitive, the margin of error wide enough to invite skepticism, but it was enough to justify another look, another series of interviews framed not as accusations, but as clarifications, and when detectives returned to the cousin by marriage, now older, more guarded, they noticed a change. Impatience where there had once been eagerness, a reluctance to speculate. A man who seemed suddenly aware that silence could be interrogated. He denied everything that mattered, again, but when asked about the night of Claire's disappearance, his timeline shifted subtly from previous statements, not enough to be a lie, but enough to register as evolution, memory reshaping itself under pressure, and investigators documented every variation. Knowing that truth rarely emerges fully formed, it accumulates through contradiction. Mark Bennett was approached once more, informed of the new analysis, the recovered data, and while his response remained controlled, those close to him noticed a change afterward, a withdrawal deeper than before, routines abandoned, a man who seemed to be preparing for something, though no one could say what, and speculation filled the gap where facts refused to go. The legal system, however, remained unmoved, prosecutors unconvinced that digital fragments could carry the weight of a murder charge without a body, without a cause of death, and the case hovered again at the edge of action, frustration building among detectives who felt closer than ever and still impossibly far away. Outside official channels, the story took on a second life. Podcasts dissecting the new findings, amateur analysts mapping currents and timelines with obsessive precision. Some convinced the case was effectively solved, others warning against confirmation bias, and the noise grew louder than the evidence, threatening to drown out the careful work still happening behind closed doors. Claire's sister watched this resurgence with wary eyes, grateful that the case hadn't been forgotten, fearful of what another cycle of attention might take from her, from the memory of her sister, and she chose her words carefully when asked about the new developments, refusing to speculate, insisting only that silence had protected someone for a very long time, and that silence, eventually, has a cost. That cost became visible in unexpected ways, in strained family gatherings, in legal disputes that reopened under the pressure of public scrutiny, in old alliances fraying as people realized that the past was no longer as safely buried as they'd believed, and investigators sensed it, the subtle loosening that comes when people grow tired of carrying secrets that no longer feel worth the wait. A former marina worker, long retired, reached out anonymously after hearing one of the podcasts, claiming he dismissed something years ago that now felt wrong, a conversation overheard, a request to adjust a log, a favor framed as trivial at the time, and while his account lacked detail, lacked names, it added to the chorus of near confessions that surrounded the case. Each one stopping just short of the line no one seemed willing to cross. Police took the statement seriously, but cautiously, aware of how memory reshapes itself under suggestion, and still, the pattern held, favors asked, logs adjusted, movements smoothed over, a network of small accommodations that, taken alone, meant nothing, but together sketched the outline of deliberate erasure. As the investigation pressed forward in inches, Sydney braced itself again, not for resolution, but for the possibility of it, a collective holding of breath born of too many false dawns, and the harbor remained the silent center of it all, unchanged, reflecting sunsets and city lights with equal indifference. In that reflection, the case lingered, not as a question of whether Claire Bennett was dead, but of how many people had known, how many had helped, how many had chosen the easier path of silence over the harder work of truth, and as the years continued to turn, that question proved harder to ignore than any lack of evidence, a pressure building beneath calm water, waiting for the moment when something, or someone, would finally break. The renewed attention unsettled people in ways the investigators hadn't fully anticipated, because silence, when prolonged for decades, develops its own inertia, and pulling at it risks unraveling more than memories. It threatens relationships, reputations, livelihoods. Detectives had learned that firsthand as minor inconsistencies became explosive when reframed against new data, when old phone pings and notebook entries gained significance that once would have been dismissed. Mark Bennett remained a careful figure in the background, deliberate, controlled, yet those observing closely noticed subtle shifts: a missed appointment, a reticence in public appearances, a lawyer's presence at personal events, gestures signaling tension, small signals of a life beginning to unravel under attention long denied. Meanwhile, the cousin by marriage became increasingly cautious, his own recollections carefully curated, aware that even an accidental slip could reshape the narrative permanently. Investigators revisited the harbor repeatedly, physically and digitally, mapping every marina, every slipway, noting currents, tides, and wind patterns in ways impossible in 1999. Each simulation suggested possibilities too precise to be random. A boat could have slipped out unnoticed, returned, the timing of phone pings aligning to suggest deliberate avoidance of surveillance, a choreography of movement invisible to outsiders, yet traceable in hindsight. It was during one of these reviews that a former dockhand, now living outside Sydney, came forward after years of fear, prompted by media coverage and a personal sense of obligation. He admitted to noticing something odd that night: a boat not matching its registered owner, a man aboard he recognized but didn't report at the time, a fleeting observation that had seemed inconsequential until now. Investigators matched the description to known associates of Mark Bennett, and while still circumstantial, the account fit neatly with previously overlooked gaps. Simultaneously, financial records revealed subtle patterns: transfers not large enough to raise flags, but consistent with someone assisting in discrete operations. Bills paid in cash, small sums moving through family members, donations to obscure charities timed to cover certain expenses. None of it proved a crime on its own, yet it formed a lattice of involvement that was hard to ignore, suggesting premeditation and coordination, a network of choices rather than accidents. Media coverage intensified, calling it the coldest cold case in Sydney history, dramatizing familial tension, the harbor as a silent witness, the notebook as a confession waiting to be interpreted. Public fascination turned to speculation, online forums dissecting evidence, recreating timelines, debating the plausibility of events down to the minute. The city buzzed with the story again, a tension between desire for justice and fear of condemning the wrong person. For Claire's sister, each publicized detail was a double-edged sword: validation that she had been right to pursue truth, yet exposure to the relentless scrutiny and speculation she had long avoided. She became more deliberate in her interactions, attending only essential interviews, speaking cautiously, reminding the media that Claire had been more than the sum of her disappearance, a living presence erased too quickly in public imagination. Investigators noted that the renewed public attention, while risky, had its advantages. Witnesses who had previously remained silent were emboldened, and small admissions trickled in: confirmations of movements, minor corrections to previously inaccurate logs, corroborations of observations once considered irrelevant. Each addition strengthened the theory, narrowing the circle of people involved, focusing suspicion on those who had proximity and motive. A final breakthrough came not from surveillance or financial records but from mundane details previously overlooked: maintenance logs showing slight discrepancies in fueling times, interviews revealing coordination between two individuals previously thought unrelated, subtle connections linking behaviors over days and weeks rather than hours. The pieces began to interlock, forming a faint but visible outline of what had occurred on that night in 1999. Even with these developments, the case remained delicate. Nothing in law had changed. Without a body or definitive forensic proof, any prosecution risked collapse, and yet the weight of circumstantial evidence and corroborated testimony pressed on the periphery of justice, creating a scenario in which truth could be observed and felt, even if it could not be legally declared. As years stretched on, Sydney learned to live with the tension, the harbor maintaining its placid surface while below, currents of implication flowed strong and cold. Residents passed the waterside often, unaware that beneath the ferry's wake lay a story of deception, loyalty, and betrayal, a network of human choices that had allowed one life to vanish and countless others to carry the weight of knowing. And so the case persisted, neither solved nor forgotten, evolving into something larger than the specifics of a disappearance, a lesson about trust, proximity, and the quiet power of silence. Reminder that sometimes the deepest mysteries exist not in what is lost, but in what people choose never to reveal. Time continued its quiet erosion, decades stretching over the city like a tide that refuses to rush, and yet the Sydney Harbor case remained lodged in memory, stubborn and cold, a wound reopened with each new lead and left raw by each unresolved question. The police files, once neat and orderly, had become a labyrinth of paper, digital fragments, interviews, and notes, evidence stacked like driftwood against a shore that never moved. Investigators, some retired, some still active, spoke in hushed tones about the night that won't die, aware that every fact, every omission, had its echo in the present. Technology offered another chance, a digital resurrection of sorts, as old phone records, marina logs, and tide data were cross-referenced using analytical software unavailable in 1999. Patterns emerged that were invisible to human scrutiny, subtle alignments of movement, timing, and anomalies that, taken together, suggested intent and coordination. The location pings, previously incomplete and dismissed, now formed trajectories that could not be ignored, tracing a path across the harbor in a way that implied careful planning rather than accident. Detectives returned to witnesses, carefully navigating decades of memory decay. Former marina employees, long retired, spoke cautiously, but in ways that created a cumulative picture. Minor details coalesced. A boat moved at unusual hours, fuel records altered slightly, lights on when they should have been off. These fragments, innocuous individually, became a lattice of suggestion, an architecture of concealment stretching across years, implicating someone who knew the harbor intimately. Mark Bennett was aware of the shifting tides of attention. Though outwardly controlled, his behavior revealed cracks. Meetings canceled abruptly, legal counsel more visible than ever, a quiet withdrawal from social circles. Observers noted the contrast between his public composure and the subtle tension in private encounters. Even those loyal to him noticed a change. Defensiveness mingled with the anxiety of someone suddenly confronted by evidence long suppressed. The cousin by marriage, the secondary figure who had hovered near suspicion for years, was also under renewed scrutiny. His earlier statements, measured and rehearsed, were juxtaposed against new timelines derived from technology. Inconsistencies, however slight, drew investigators' attention, each one a potential clue in a network of complicity. The careful choreography of memory, alibi, and silence began to unravel under the weight of converging data. For Claire Bennett's sister, the decade-plus journey had reshaped grief into determination. Public discussion, forensic advancements, witness cooperation, all of it reinforced a painful clarity. Claire's disappearance was no accident, no random misfortune. The harbor, once a place of work and beauty, had become a stage for choices that betrayed trust, the decisions of familiar hands silently orchestrating her vanishing. As the investigation pressed forward, media narratives followed, each new revelation a spark to old embers. Terms like family betrayal, cold case breakthrough, and hidden movements circulated widely. Online forums dissected every known detail, reimagined every possibility. Amateur sleuths and retired detectives alike analyzed title charts and security logs, creating visualizations that emphasized precision over speculation. Even with all this attention, the city's mood remained tense, anticipation tempered by the understanding that truth in a decades-old case is fragile, incomplete, and dangerous if assumed too quickly. Investigators made careful, incremental moves, building dossiers, securing witness statements, and using data analytics to map relationships and opportunities. Each step forward illuminated the web of connections without providing a definitive conclusion. The harbor itself, unchanged in its physical form, became a repository of invisible evidence, slips, docks, tides, and currents acting as silent witnesses to a night that no one could fully recall. Despite the advancements, legal obstacles persisted. Without a body, the burden of proof remained enormous. Circumstantial evidence, even when overwhelming, could falter under cross-examination. Prosecutors wrestled with the knowledge that the story was clearer outside the courtroom than it could ever be within it, and that any misstep risked years of progress collapsing back into uncertainty. The haunting of the case continued in subtle ways. Locals walking along the harbor at night sensed its shadow, the ferries cutting through reflections, streetlights bouncing on water, the quiet suspicion that beneath the calm lay a story of betrayal, premeditation, and complicity. Claire's presence lingered, reconstructed through memories, testimonies, and reconstructed timelines, her absence paradoxically making her more present than ever in the collective consciousness. And through it all, the harbor remained indifferent, reflecting city lights with deceptive tranquility, a silent witness to the movements of people who had long ago learned the cost of secrets. The cold case was not merely unsolved, it was a living tension, a persistent echo of a vanished life and a network of decisions that had allowed it to happen, a story stretching across decades, shaping the city, the family, and everyone who dared look too closely at the water. Even as Sydney continued its rhythm, new developments trickled in slowly. A corroborated statement here, a minor financial anomaly there, each piece a tentative push toward clarity, yet the ultimate truth remained elusive, hovering like mist over the harbor, whispering that some mysteries endure not because they are unsolvable, but because the people who hold them refuse to speak. The harbor seemed unchanged, calm under the summer moon, yet beneath the mirrored surface, the story of Claire Bennett rippled endlessly, invisible to most, in currents that carried memory, suspicion, and unspoken truths. By now, decades had passed since her disappearance, yet the case remained alive, not in arrests or convictions, but in the persistent pulse of questions no one could fully answer, a cold case that refused to rest. Mark Bennett, once seemingly untouchable, had retreated further from public life. His movements were discreet, measured, his presence minimized as if the scrutiny itself could become physical, pressing down, leaving traces in interactions and gestures that sharp-eyed observers noticed. Each subtle flinch, each careful word, fed the narrative of suspicion that had long outlived formal legal proceedings. The cousin by marriage, too, lived under quiet tension, a life governed by memories too inconvenient to speak aloud and associations too incriminating to ignore. Technological advances continued to reopen the case in small, incremental ways, restored data from phones and emails, digital reconstructions of harbor tides and boat movements, and meticulous cross-referencing of logs and personal records. These fragments, while never enough to produce a definitive verdict, coalesced into a lattice of suggestion, a ghostly architecture that traced the night Claire vanished in unprecedented detail. Each discovery sharpened focus, but left gaps where memory and circumstance had long conspired to erase clarity. Former witnesses, emboldened by time or conscience, contributed quietly, an offhand observation remembered suddenly, a previous hesitation replaced with tentative confirmation, small inconsistencies acknowledged that, when stitched together, formed a chilling pattern of coordination and concealment. These pieces, innocuous on their own, gradually became a collective outline of the choices that led to Claire's disappearance, a pattern as precise as it was incomplete, a story told in the silences between statements as much as in words spoken aloud. Public fascination endured, driven by podcasts, documentaries, and investigative journalism that replayed the same sequences of betrayal, silence, and suspicion. The phrases family betrayal, cold case breakthrough, and harbor mystery circulated with renewed energy, drawing attention to the complex interplay of trust and deception. Sydney's residents followed developments with a mixture of morbid curiosity and unease, aware that some crimes linger beyond evidence, shaping consciousness and memory alike. For Claire's sister, the decades of unresolved grief had transformed into a vigilant guardianship of her sister's legacy. Each public retelling, every podcast episode or news article, carried potential validation, yet risked distortion. She navigated these waters cautiously, protecting not just Claire's memory, but the fragile thread of truth that persisted despite the passage of time. Her determination ensured that the story remained anchored in reality, resisting the sensationalism that threatened to flatten Claire into a mere archetype of victimhood. Investigators remained vigilant, sustaining momentum through patient diligence. Even with the absence of a body or definitive forensic evidence, the cold case held the weight of possibility, strengthened by decades of circumstantial corroboration and carefully documented testimony. Each corroboration, every new alignment of data and memory, narrowed the circle of those who might have acted, illuminating motives and opportunities previously obscured by the haze of time. And yet, the case's resolution remained tantalizingly out of reach. The harbor, calm and indifferent, mirrored the city above, reflecting streetlights and ferry trails with deceptive serenity, hiding beneath the surface the intricate choreography of human decisions that had led to tragedy. The waters bore witness silently, the ripples of past actions persisting as subtle reminders that some truths cannot be fully captured, only traced, inferred, and respected for the lives they affected. As Sydney moved forward, the cold case persisted, a persistent echo in institutional memory and public imagination. The story became less about proof and more about implication, less about closure, and more about the enduring presence of absence. Residents walking along the harbor sensed its shadow, the knowledge that beneath the calm exterior lay a tale of planning, betrayal, and silence, a reminder of the consequences of proximity and trust misused. The case's legacy was dual, a cautionary tale and a monument to endurance, preserving both the haunting absence of Claire Bennett and the slow, meticulous pursuit of truth by those who refused to let the cold case fade into oblivion. In the end, Sydney's harbor remained both witness and grave, reflecting the city's lights, the passage of decades, and the unyielding gravity of a mystery unresolved, leaving behind only the persistent weight of knowing, the echo of choices made, and the silent reminder that some stories never conclude, only continue to haunt the spaces they occupy. Even now, when the ferries glide past and the moon casts silver paths across the water, the cold case persists, not in headlines, not in verdicts, but in the tension beneath calm surfaces, in the unspoken truth carried by the currents, in the haunting knowledge that some betrayals, once enacted, echo endlessly, shaping everyone who comes after, leaving the harbor forever marked by one vanished life and the silence that surrounds it. Years blended into one another, and the story of Claire Bennett persisted like a low hum beneath Sydney's daily rhythm, a tension invisible yet palpable, threading through conversations, news segments, and the occasional casual comment from someone who remembered 1999 all too vividly. Cold cases rarely age with grace. They corrode patience, twist perception, and force a city to reconcile the ordinary with the unthinkable. In this harbor, the ordinary and the unthinkable collided nightly in reflections across the water, in shadows cast by cranes, in the faint creak of moored boats, carrying the weight of a vanished woman across decades. Investigators, seasoned and retired alike, still lingered in the margins, reviewing digital archives, re-examining witness statements, comparing old marina logs with newly recovered data, replaying interviews until subtle shifts in phrasing leapt out as meaningful. They tracked every discrepancy, every omission, every hesitation, knowing the smallest detail might finally bridge the decades-long gap between suspicion and certainty. The notebook, once dismissed as a marginal curiosity, was revisited, its contents analyzed with forensic precision, and for the first time, its coded references and cryptic notes began to align with tangible events, constructing a lattice of plausible actions against a timeline that had previously seemed indecipherable. Mark Bennett's life had narrowed, carefully curated, his presence in public spaces minimized. The tension of decades of suspicion pressed down on him invisibly, yet relentlessly. Observers noted a meticulous control over interactions, legal counsel present for nearly every encounter, eyes constantly scanning, body language taut. Even those close to him sensed a shift, a subtle acknowledgement that the past could not remain contained indefinitely, that silence could no longer protect. The cousin by marriage exhibited similar behavior, retreating into routines, his earlier composure replaced by subtle anxiety, as if decades of secrecy weighed heavily, and every interaction could potentially unspool the careful fabric of denial. Digital reconstructions of the harbor's tides, boat movements, and marina traffic provided new insight into the night Claire vanished. Previously ignored anomalies, the timing of boats leaving slips, minor discrepancies in fuel records, patterns of lighting, now formed a coherent, if chilling, narrative of intent and coordination. Each fragment of evidence, once innocuous, became part of a larger architecture of concealment. Even without the body, the orchestration of events painted a picture of meticulous planning and deliberate obfuscation, a choreography invisible to casual observers, yet legible in hindsight. Witnesses, emboldened by time and media attention, came forward quietly. An offhand remark recalled after 20 years, an overlooked observation now clearly significant, subtle corrections to old statements, all contributed to a growing mosaic of implied action. Memory, fragile yet persistent, revealed small, incriminating consistencies, forming a lattice of human behavior that hinted at complicity, coordination, and betrayal. Each addition deepened understanding while leaving frustrating gaps. Truth was emerging, but selectively, as though deliberately teasing investigators. The media amplified every development, framing the cold case as a story of family betrayal and harbor intrigue, highlighting the interplay of trust, secrecy, and proximity. Podcasts and documentaries dissected evidence and witness statements, reconstructing the night in painstaking detail, drawing audiences into speculation and scrutiny. While public fascination surged, the careful work of investigators continued behind the scenes, deliberate, methodical, cautious of assumptions, aware that a single misstep could destroy years of accumulated insight. For Claire's sister, these developments were both vindication and exhaustion, a mixture of relief that the case had not been forgotten and frustration that silence, complicity, and fear had allowed the mystery to endure for decades. Each interview, each renewed spotlight, reminded her that truth carries consequences far beyond courtroom proceedings, that the psychological gravity of the case had altered lives, perceptions, and the very texture of daily existence. And yet, even with new technology, witness statements, and corroborated patterns, the case resisted closure. Sydney Harbor remained placid, deceptively serene, reflecting city lights and ferry wakes, hiding beneath the surface the meticulous orchestration that had allowed one woman to disappear. The cold case persisted, not as a puzzle with a solution, but as a living tension between known facts and unknown motives, a quiet echo of betrayal and secrecy stretching across decades. Even now, the waters carry memory. Every ferry passing in the moonlight, every boat slicing silently through the harbor, whispers of that night linger, subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The case is no longer only about Claire Bennett. It is about the choices that allowed her to vanish, the silence that protected perpetrators, the enduring impact on those left behind. Sydney's harbor, calm and reflective by day, conceals beneath its surface a story that refuses to conclude, a narrative of absence, complicity, and unspoken truth that continues to haunt the city. In the end, the cold case exists not just in files or forensic reconstructions, not only in witness statements or media coverage, but in the space between certainty and doubt, in the currents beneath the city's familiar lights, in the collective memory of a community that knows something remains unresolved, and in the silent, unrelenting echo of a betrayal that time cannot wash away. Even as decades slipped by, the case exerted a subtle gravity, pulling at the edges of memory and perception. Investigators who had retired continued to check in, offering advice, rereading old reports, cross-referencing minor details against newly discovered fragments, all in the quiet knowledge that the truth remained incomplete but persistent. The harbor itself seemed to pulse with memory, tides carrying whispers of movements once unnoticed, reflections on the water reminding the city that absence leaves traces, invisible yet enduring. Mark Bennett's life had become a careful choreography of avoidance. Public appearances were calculated, interactions scrutinized, and every gesture measured for impact. Friends and colleagues observed the tension that radiated from him, a vigilance born of decades of speculation and renewed investigation. The cousin by marriage mirrored this wariness, retreating into routine, a life structured to avoid drawing attention to the gaps that investigators were quietly mapping. Together, their silence became almost a character in the story, a tense, breathing presence that reinforced the mystery while resisting exposure. The recovered digital fragments, phone pings, logs, timestamps, continued to yield subtle revelations. Minute anomalies, overlooked for years, now suggested coordination, the deliberate sequencing of movement across the harbor, the careful avoidance of witnesses, and the meticulous timing that would have allowed someone to act unseen. Investigators reconstructed these patterns repeatedly, each simulation reinforcing the possibility of orchestration, of intent, without ever providing the definitive evidence that could end the case. Witness testimony, decades old but freshly corroborated, formed an uneasy lattice of knowledge. Former dock workers, marina employees, neighbors, each memory fragment contributed to an image that was chilling in its coherence, revealing the interplay of human decision, opportunity, and complicity. Minor discrepancies, once considered irrelevant, now hinted at deliberate choices. A door left unlocked, a boat moved at night, a conversation half-remembered, all converging toward the night Claire disappeared. Public fascination intensified, fueled by podcasts, news specials, and online forums. The story of the harbor, family betrayal, and unresolved mystery captured imaginations, each retelling layering intrigue upon intrigue. Yet the pulse of the investigation persisted quietly beneath the noise, careful, deliberate, unyielding, driven by the understanding that true resolution requires patience, precision, and a respect for the subtleties that often elude immediate perception. Claire Bennett's sister, decades older, carried the weight of the unresolved case with a fierce persistence. She guarded her sister's memory against distortion, asserting the reality of Claire's life and the injustice of her disappearance. Each public discussion, each new insight, served as both vindication and reminder that the harbor had taken more than a person. It had reshaped a family, a city's consciousness, and the very texture of time in Sydney. The harbor itself remained indifferent, reflecting city lights and ferry wakes with deceptive calm. Beneath its surface lay evidence invisible to most, currents that preserved memory, and the silent architecture of human actions that had led to a life vanishing. Each ripple, each wave against the docks, became a subtle echo of history, a reminder that the story was not finished, that the past's weight remained tangible in the present. Even with new technologies, meticulous reconstructions, and corroborated testimony, the cold case endured as a tension, unresolved, unyielding. It was a study in absence, a testament to the persistence of human behavior, the consequences of betrayal, and the endurance of silence. Sydney Harbor carried the story silently, shaping perception, memory, and the lives of those connected to it, reminding all who approached its waters that some mysteries are not merely unsolved, they are enduring, haunting, and fundamentally inseparable from the fabric of the city itself. The cold case, now decades old, exists not in conclusion but in the continued observation of patterns, in the vigilance of those unwilling to let time erase truth, and in the quiet, unrelenting awareness that beneath Sydney's harbor lights, the echoes of betrayal, disappearance, and unresolved tension continue to reverberate, leaving a permanent mark on everyone who dares to look closely at what remains hidden beneath calm waters. Time continued its quiet pressure, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything all the same. The case lived on in systems now largely automated, its details converted into data points, its photographs scanned and enhanced until grain turned into abstraction. What once required intuition now required calibration. Analysts adjusted parameters, widened thresholds, allowed the software to see what human eyes could not. Patterns emerged and dissolved. Leads flickered briefly, then went dark. Each development carried the same warning: possibility is not proof, and cold cases survive on that distinction. Occasionally, a call still came in. A memory triggered by a documentary. A face glimpsed in an old yearbook. A confession hinted at, and then withdrawn. Investigators learned to listen without expectation, to follow up without optimism. Most tips unraveled quickly, victims of time's distortions. But every so often, one lingered just long enough to reopen familiar questions. Where exactly did the car stop? How long would a conversation have lasted? Who could move through that space without attracting attention? These weren't new questions. They were old ones asked again because they had never been answered. The idea that the crime was part of something larger gained quiet traction, not officially, not publicly, but in the way professionals adjusted their assumptions. They reconsidered timelines, expanded geographic boundaries, compared behaviors across decades. The possibility reframed the case, without changing its facts, transforming isolation into sequence. If the woman had not been the only one, then her disappearance carried a different weight, not random, not singular, but indicative. That thought stayed with them, unsettling and persistent. The suspect's name appeared and disappeared in internal discussions, always accompanied by the same caution. Without evidence that could withstand challenge, a name was just noise. They watched him from a distance, through records and public traces, noting patterns that might matter or might mean nothing at all. Age had altered him, softened edges, blurred the figure he once was. Time can be a defense as effective as innocence. It erodes urgency, dilutes outrage, replaces certainty with doubt. For the family, the passage of years became its own language, one spoken in anniversaries and silences. They measured life not by closure, but by accommodation, learning how to carry unanswered questions without letting them define every moment. Still, there were nights when the waiting pressed harder, when the absence felt newly sharp, as if the decades had collapsed into a single instant. On those nights, they returned to the same thought, that somewhere, the truth existed whole and untouched, even if it remained unreachable. The community's relationship with the case shifted again as a new generation took notice. Podcasts dissected the timeline. Online forums debated theories with forensic intensity. The story was retold, reinterpreted, sometimes misunderstood. Investigators watched this from the sidelines, aware of both the value and the danger of renewed attention. Public interest can revive leads, but it can also distort them, replacing evidence with narrative momentum. They remained careful, protective of the facts, resistant to speculation. The road itself had become almost anonymous, stripped of the details that once anchored the story. What remained was symbolic rather than physical, a reminder embedded in cautionary advice and half-remembered warnings. It represented how quickly normalcy can fracture, how thin the line is between routine and catastrophe. For those who knew the case well, that knowledge never faded, even as the world around it moved forward. The Illinois 1990 cold case endured not because it resisted resolution, but because it demanded attention in quieter ways. It influenced training, shaped protocols, informed how officers approached the unexpected. It became a reference point, an example used not for what was solved, but for what remained elusive. In that sense, it continued to matter, continuing to exert influence long after headlines had stopped. Somewhere within the accumulated evidence, within the patterns still incomplete, the answer waited, unchanged by time's passing. Whether it would ever surface was uncertain. But the case persisted, held together by memory, by data, by the refusal to let absence become erasure. It remained what it had always been, a story without an ending, a question without a reply, echoing quietly through years that could not quite leave it behind. The years pressed on with a steadiness that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself were testing the resolve of everyone who still carried the case with them. Nothing dramatic announced the next shift.
No sirens.
No urgent calls. Just a subtle change in how the information was viewed, a reevaluation prompted not by discovery, but by perspective. Investigators began asking different questions, not about what happened, but about how it could have happened without leaving more behind. The absence of evidence, once seen as a failure of the past, was reconsidered as a clue in itself. They studied restraint, the lack of witnesses, the precision of disappearance. This was not chaos. This was control. Whoever was responsible understood the mechanics of compliance, the psychology of authority, the advantage of appearing ordinary. That realization didn't add facts, but it sharpened the existing ones, aligning them into a profile that felt increasingly specific. Not a stranger passing through by chance, but someone who belonged just enough to be trusted, someone whose presence would not have raised alarms. That understanding cast the old traffic stop in a harsher light.
Routine had been the weapon.
Familiarity, the disguise. It explained why no one intervened, why no one questioned what they saw. The crime had unfolded in plain sight, protected by expectations. That idea unsettled everyone who revisited the file. It suggested that the most dangerous moments are often the least conspicuous, that threat does not always announce itself with force. As these interpretations settled, attention returned to overlooked details, minor inconsistencies once dismissed as irrelevant. The timing of radio logs, the phrasing of early witness statements, the way certain procedures were followed too precisely, others ignored entirely. None of it was enough to reopen proceedings, but together they formed a texture that felt intentional. Investigators documented these insights carefully, aware that meaning sometimes emerges only when the right eyes encounter the right context. The suspect remained distant, insulated by years and legality, his life unfolding without visible disruption. If he sensed anything, it was invisible from the outside. There were no sudden moves, no defensive gestures. He existed as he always had, quietly, blending into a world that no longer remembered the urgency of 1990. That normalcy, more than anything, became unsettling. It raised the question of how many truths pass unnoticed simply because they resemble everything else. For the family, the case's evolution brought conflicting emotions. Each new interpretation suggested progress, but also reinforced the reality that certainty might never arrive. They listened, they nodded, they thanked the people who still cared enough to look again. And then they returned to their lives, to routines built around an absence that had become permanent. Hope for them was no longer a destination but a discipline, something practiced carefully to avoid collapse. Public interest flared briefly once more as fragments of these reassessments leaked into discussion. Articles spoke of new perspectives and reframed theories, careful not to promise resolution. The language was restrained, almost cautious, as if everyone involved understood how easily expectation can turn into disappointment. The case surfaced, lingered, then slipped back into the background, leaving behind only questions sharpened rather than answered. The road continued to absorb its own history. Weather erased markings. Traffic smoothed imperfections. What had once been a focal point became just another stretch of pavement, indistinguishable from the miles before and after it. Yet for those who knew, it remained charged, a silent witness to how effortlessly a life can vanish when trust is misplaced. The Illinois 1990 cold case persisted not as an active pursuit, but as a reference, a shadow example used to teach, to warn, to remind. It informed how officers approached uncertainty, how they balanced assumption against verification. In that way, the case continued to shape outcomes elsewhere, even as it resisted conclusion itself. And beneath all of it, the unanswered question remained intact, unaltered by reinterpretation or time. What truly happened in those moments by the roadside? The answer did not fade. It waited, embedded in the past, patient and unmoved, a reminder that some truths do not surface on command, but on their own terms, if they surface at all. By the time the case reached its 15th turn through memory and re-examination, it no longer felt like an investigation in motion, but like a presence that refused to leave. It existed in the background of other cases, other crimes, other late nights under fluorescent lights, surfacing unexpectedly when something felt familiar, when a detail echoed too closely. Detectives who had never worked the original file still knew its contours. They knew the year. They knew the road. They knew the phrase cold case carried more weight here than usual. A quiet development emerged not from evidence, but from absence. Analysts noticed how consistently certain records were missing, not destroyed, not altered, simply never created where they should have been. Paperwork gaps that followed a pattern. Times when procedure suggested documentation, but none existed. It was subtle, the kind of thing only visible after decades of comparison, and it suggested something uncomfortable. Not negligence. Not coincidence. Intent. The implication shifted the emotional gravity of the case. If records were intentionally avoided, then someone had been thinking ahead, anticipating scrutiny, minimizing trace. That kind of foresight narrowed the field further, pointing away from impulse and toward experience. Toward someone who understood systems well enough to exploit their blind spots. Someone who knew what not to write down. The old traffic stop became sharper in that context. Not a moment of escalation, but of calculation. A controlled interaction designed to look forgettable. The brilliance, if it could be called that, was in its simplicity. No violence witnessed. No struggle recorded. Just a woman complying with what she believed was authority, stepping out of visibility,